Vimeo so you can see that.
Okay, so we are recording this. Neil has said that you take questions along the way, but the way we'll do the questions so as to not interfere with who grabs the attention is if you can use the chat and post your questions in the chat. I will keep an eye on what's in the chat, and then ask Neil obviously the questions that come up. Okay, so without further ado, Neil, welcome to the online Zoom of PSSZ. We thank you for your time. It is 9 o'clock, 9:10 on Friday night in New Jersey on a summer's evening. But over to you.
Hi, everyone. I just want to introduce myself properly. I'm originally from South Africa, and then 20 years ago, we emigrated to the United States. And I used to be a television broadcast engineer or engineering tech. And then I was a stay-at-home dad for 3 years. And when I got my work permit, I thought I want to go back into broadcasting. I'm 3 years out of date. It's a different technology. We use PEL in South Africa. In America, we use NTSC, etc. So want to do that? Yeah. Or do I want to go into what I love, photography? And during the time that I was a stay-at-home dad, I started writing stuff on a blog, or what was a blog before blogs were blogs. And it kind of picked up steam. Here's the link. It's the Tangents blog. There's about 1,000 articles there on various aspects of photography. A lot of it deals with lighting, some reviews. It's just whatever I want to write about. That's why it's called Tangents. And a publisher asked me to write a book. Wrote a book for them. It was a bestseller. It's the On Camera Flash. And then by now I've written 5 books. And so that's how a lot of photographers know me, is through the tutorials and the articles on that blog. Now, my photography work, I used to be very wedding centric in what I do. And then about 8 years ago, I got a commercial studio space. And this is the second space that I'm in. You can see behind me, a lot of lighting gear, square box with a lot of lighting gear. And what I do now is headshots, portraits. I do product photography. I photograph corporate events, obviously not in the studio. I do product photography. I do a wide range of things, including time-lapse photography. So I'll post a link to my website there, and in the menu you'll see the link to time-lapse and everything else that I do. It's the work that I do. And then over weekends, I still shoot weddings and shoot as a principal and a second shooter for other studios. I kind of like the idea that I don't have to sit in front of the computer and edit that stuff. I go out and shoot, hand over the images, get my money, and then during the week, I concentrate on my work, which is corporate and commercial stuff and headshots and all that. Now, I kind of fell into time-lapse photography. Now, I would get a royalty check every 2 months from my publisher. And what I would do is I would take a certain portion of it as just splash money. I would just splash it out on whatever I want, just treat myself. And the rest I would obviously try and spend sensibly by buying more equipment. But you know, investing in the business, let's call it that. But then I would splash some money. And there was a time-lapse photographer in New York called Mind Relic. And his stuff was phenomenal. It was all transitions from nighttime to day or day to night, and the camera would move. And it was just beautifully cinematic and fantastic. And on his posts, he'd post all the equipment he'd use. And I used that as a shopping list. So I bought everything that it has, a certain brand, dynamic perception, I bought it. Great. And the equipment was in my study for about nearly a year before I used it. And at some point, I'm like, I need to get out and use the stuff. So I did 2 shoots for myself in New York where I'd go out, and it was a motion dolly. And you'll see a photograph a little later on where the camera is on a 6-foot dolly, 2 tripods, and the camera gradually moves over the period of 20 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, however long it might be. And that movement, then every few seconds or minute, the camera would take a shot, and you'd compile that, and it became a cinematic sweep as the camera moved. And then you'd have 30 minutes over a period of 30 minutes, you'd compress that into 30 seconds and you get that time lapse. Anyway, went out to New York twice to shoot some time lapse videos, put it out on my website. And a few months later, a German television station contacted me and said, they love the time lapses. Could they possibly buy them from me to use in the international news items? I'm like, yeah. So I sold the rights to the time lapse videos to the German television station for the news. And I made my money back on what I'd spent on the equipment. And went like, oh, this is interesting. So with that, I started putting out more time lapses on my website, and it started picking up speed where I do a fair amount of time lapse photography, commercial use. For this, I have 5 Nikon D810 cameras that I use, each with a lens. Only one of the cameras do I swap lenses out. The other 4, the lenses are fixed. I clean the sensor to a pristine level, absolutely pristine, not a single spot. Because if you shoot 1,000 frames for time lapse and you have dust on your sensor, you want to kill yourself. It is horrendous work to try and clean that out. So I found that it is cheaper for me to buy a camera, clean the sensor absolutely perfectly clean, pop a lens on, and the lens remains married on the camera. That is it. Lens does not come off again. So with that, I've got 5 cameras that I use dedicated just for time lapses. So occasionally it'll be 1 or 2 cameras out. Sometimes it'll be up to 5 cameras out. I've had time-lapse projects where I have 7 cameras out on the project. So that is equipment just dedicated for time-lapse. And then I have a separate camera bag for events and weddings and stuff. Anyway, so I started shooting a lot of time-lapses. And it started picking up speed. And sort of the high point was 2 years ago, I was called on to a production team that had to do an advert for Major League Baseball here in America. And they wanted to create a video advert, obviously, and then they needed time lapse. And I wanted 2 sequences shot with dollies. So I had 2 dollies. So I was obviously a good choice because I had the equipment and I seemed to have the experience. I shot the time lapses. Gave them the files, they edited, put it together. And a few months later, the producer sent out an email and said, hey guys, we won an Emmy. And I wrote back, oh, congratulations, that's awesome. And another month or so, I get an email that looked like spam and said, what do I want to order? A statue, a plaque, a certificate, etc. And I'm like, I was about to delete it and like, what? Let me just click through on this. Click through and it's the Academy. My name is on the roll as part of the team that won an Emmy. So I could order a little statue. So $500 later, I have my statue. Actually, I should have pulled it off the shelf there. Anyway, I got an Emmy for time lapse. So that was quite a big deal. So along also the other clients that I have now, when a photographer tells you they have a big name for a client, Apple or whatever it might be, it's a bit of a stretch. It's usually they're working for a team that is hired by the agency that's working for, it's always like 4 or 5 levels deep from the actual company. So when I say I've got Jaguar as a client, and I've got Google as a client, and I've got Major League Baseball as a client, and a bunch of other big names, I am actually working for a videographer that was hired by the production team, that was hired by the agency, that was hired by the social media team, whatever, of the company. It's like 4 or 5 levels deep, but hey, I've got big name clients. So let's click through. If you open up the PDF file, we can start with that. And I'm going to share my screen to make sure that I'm in the right spot. So at this point, if you want to ask questions, just type it in the chat and we'll pick it up as we go along. I have to not lose my place. Okay, so again, the neilvan.com tangents, that's the blog with a lot of photography material. And then the timelapse nyc.photo will resolve to my main website and the time-lapse stuff. And then on the second page, there's the promotional video for Major League Baseball. And there are 4 links to click there. The first one, if you want to have a look, is the final award-winning video for Major League Baseball, including the footage they shot for them, but with their own video editor in. So it's quite a dynamic one. And on the right-hand side, there's the page. That's the link to the page where I wrote all about it. All these are there. So if you want to, let's click on my edit of the footage I shot. So it's a second link there. If you click through on it, you'll get to, I had 6 cameras there, plus a 7th camera that was doing hyperlapse. So 2 of the cameras are on dollies, so you get that motion. The other 4 cameras were static, but 2 of them I zoomed in during post. So if you click through that, you will see it. And in this edit, which I just did for myself, some of the footage I kept static and others I zoomed in. Now, this is where it helps that I'm shooting with a Nikon D810, which is 36 megapixels. If you take it to 1080p video, 1080p video is about a little over 2 megapixels. So I'm shooting 36 megapixel images and I'm only using 2 megapixels. So it means you can zoom in to a phenomenal degree on the image with no deterioration in the video and the final video quality. And if you go back to the PDF file, there's a behind the scenes video of the motion dollies that I used. So this is just video showing the motion dollies. So if you click on that video, it'll open up and it's a short video. I think it's about 45 seconds or maybe a minute even. But you'll see the 2 dollies and the camera is on a slider. The camera is moved by a motor connected to a controller. And the controller is programmed with my phone. So I can set up how long the camera should run, the interval, the duration. Everything is controlled through an app on my phone. And with that, I can shoot 300, 600, 900, however many images that I need to capture the entire event. Now, there's artists doing the spray paint art. They would take between 3 to 4 hours completing a mural. So I had to make sure that the duration that I set my camera for would move from one end to the other end, taking 4 hours. So they have that gradual sweep across over 4 hours and then compiled as a minute video. Obviously, the Major League Baseball team, they did a completely different edit, which you can see later on if you want to, clicking on the video. And again, if you want the write-up about it and photographs of the equipment that I used, all of that, if you click through an article on the right-hand side on the second page, you'll get through to that page. Okay, I'm going to click through to the next image. Now, mostly when I shoot time-lapse, it's just a camera on a tripod. It's static. It's a very simple setup. But for more interesting video, you want a cinematic movement. So here is a dolly. So you have the 2 tripods, and the camera is going to move from a low viewpoint, pull back, pull back, pull back, pull back, all the way up. And later on, we'll get to a link where you can see that video. And as I said, it's controlled. It has a controller and a battery. And the controller is programmed with an app on my phone. So that's it. Now, I have to have very sturdy tripods here. If there's any kind of wiggle to the tripod, that whole video is going to wobble. It looks horrendous. It's unsalvageable. Then clicking through into the next image, here is a motion controller as well. The camera rotates 360 degrees. So again, a heavy tripod. You can see the controller or the motor hanging there below the motion, what do you call it, motion device. And the motor controls it and it's going to turn the camera. Now, here I have a neutral density filter over the camera because you want to take your shutter speed as low as possible. There's specific reasons. We'll go through the calculation for that. But if you're going to do time lapse, you'll have to invest in neutral density filters to bring your shutter speed down, down, down to get motion blur. There's a very specific reason for it. If your shutter speed is too high, everything looks choppy. So you kind of want that smooth blur and neutral density filters. So here's a close-up of that motion dolly. This one doesn't move on a rack. This just rotates, and you can set it up on an angle. Now, the next one is a scene from a Port Newark container terminal. This is where they pull in thousands of containers every day off ships and put them on ships. It's one of the major ports on the eastern seaboard of America. And the, what's the guy called? The operations manager wanted me to do a time lapse to show the transformation as they broke down older buildings, etc., and revamped it and put up new roads, new buildings, and just completely changed the layout. So for this, this particular time-lapse project ran for 3 years. I would go in once a month to change the card on the camera. So on the left-hand side, you can see the solar panel. The solar panel with a cable feeds the dome, the camera in the dome. It feeds the battery in the dome. The battery powers the camera, and there's a controller again that takes a shot every minute or every 5 minutes or every 10 minutes as you would program it. Anyway, this thing ran for 3 years, and it eventually paid well. The whole setup there is about $4,000, including the camera and everything else, but it eventually broke even. Eventually I made a profit, but yeah, this was very interesting. Okay, so on the next page, we've got 6 videos there. So we're going to have a quick look at them. So hopefully everybody's on track here. You should be on page 7, where you see 6 small images. And the one on the top left will be the motion dolly that you saw, the motion dolly on the dock. The next one is the tent that a few of us saw already. And the bottom right-hand one is the link to the 3-year-long time lapse. So let's click on the top left-hand one, the motion dolly time lapse, where it's the Manhattan view. So if you click through on that, it should open up, oops, let's try again. If you click through on that, it should open up the video. So let me just find it myself. And you can see the effect here, the clouds swirling by the boat, and then the boats on the river just swirling by. And then as the camera moves away, you just have a wider view and a wider view. Now, unfortunately, on this day, I didn't have much clouds. I didn't have the clouds swirling around. So that would have been the ideal. But anyway, that gives you a sense of what it looks like when you have that motion dolly. You have that sweep, the cinematic sweep.
Neil,
yeah.
In a location like that, how did you avoid the vibrations with people walking on that boardwalk?
It's very solid. It's very solid. Then also you can run plugins in your video program that'll stabilize the motion. So you can actually stabilize it. But that dock is very solid. I had a bigger time shooing people away. So I had to like, whoa, 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 and just kind of make sure people don't step in front of the camera. Okay, so let's click on the top right-hand one. The behind the scenes time lapse for Jaguar. Now here I had to do time lapse of the photographer taking photographs of the 2 new hybrid models of the Jaguar cars. So I had to do time lapses for him, and I sent the files to the agency and they did whatever they needed to. I created this time lapse for myself. So if you click through on that, I just took the footage from the dollies. I didn't use the static cameras. And you can see on one point I had the dolly wasn't on tripod, it was just flat in the ground, and the camera just swept along the ground, which is a nice, very dramatic view. And then some of them, the camera came from high up low or pulled back. Just all of the photographer doing his thing. So on the middle level on that page, there's a tent preparation, and then there's another wedding at a massive reception venue here. Let's click on that one. Let's click on the middle video on the right-hand side, which says Cipriani wedding preparation. If you click on that, I had one camera. This took about 4 or 5 days. I think about 5 days. Camera was mounted above, and that ran the whole time. That one ran off power. And then I had another 4 cameras on tripods, which I would move around depending on where they were building stuff. I didn't do anything here with motion dollies because that would just get in the way. It was really frantic how they would set stuff up. So anyway, this is now the Cipriani wedding preparation video. And again, over the top production. I wouldn't know how much they spent on the flowers even. And it's all just for a final 4-hour party, which you can see right at the end of the video. There's a bit of swirling, they're dancing, that's it. So for me, it's insane. They actually did put in carpets just for this wedding, and they stripped the carpets out again when they were done. So it's mind-blowing just how much money they dumped into this one wedding.
Neil, there's a question in the chat. How long were you shooting that Manhattan waterfront?
Oh, the Manhattan waterfront was about 30 minutes or 40 minutes. So it's fairly quick. That I just did for myself, my own project, just test out the equipment. And, you know, your skills definitely depend on practice. That I think everybody knows that. It's the amount of time that you have a camera in your hands and become familiar with the buttons and all that transfers into an ease of shooting. So it's always good to just practice. That was for my own portfolio.
Didn't sound terribly.
So any other questions? So let's click on the bottom right-hand one, the 3-year-long time lapse. This one I think is actually fairly long. It's about 4 minutes long. So I'm not going to wait 4 minutes while everybody watched. I just want to give it a minute to get an idea of what happens there. So for this time lapse, that was the camera in that white dome, the weatherproof dome, where I'd go in once a month and swap cards out. And you can see the buildings being demolished. It's like Pac-Man going, eating the buildings. And that all gets demolished. Now, here I had an extremely wide-angle view, 24 megapixels, which meant I could zoom in on one side. And later on, a year later, I could zoom wider. And then again, 2 years in, I could zoom again tighter. So I can concentrate on whatever is in the scene in front of me. That's why it's very useful shooting with a high resolution camera. What I found interesting with this 3-year-long time lapse is the people that were working there. I chatted to the security guards. You know, you go in once a month or twice a month. They know your face, and I would go up to the roof to maintain the cameras. When this was all done, I did more projects for them. But when I'd compiled the video, I would have it on my iPad and would show it to the security guards and other people working there, and they were astonished because you absolutely do not have a sense of scale during that 3 years. I mean, you'd come into work and they're busy working, and a month later they're busy working. So they're always working for 3 years, but you don't have a overall sense of the scale of the project. But once this is condensed into a 3-minute or 2-minute or 4-minute video, whatever it might be, you go, holy crap, this is amazing. I mean, everything gets demolished, roads get diverted, buildings get erected, new gates being erected. So you really get a sense of what was happening there. And this is why the project manager, not the project manager, the operations manager hired me to do the time lapse, because it was easier for him now to explain to people afterwards what they were doing and obviously get more funds for other projects. So I think instead of standing there in front of a team of people waving your hands around, you could go watch this video, and then 3 minutes later, people go, "Oh yeah, I get it." So for the final one on this page, let's go to the bottom left of that page. So we're back on page 7 of the PDF. So the bottom left is the Port Newark Container Terminal straddle carriers. They spent about 4 months building each of these 2 cranes in place. That was a different time-lapse project. And then on this day, they moved them into position along the wharf where they would service the ships that would dock. They would put the they would put the containers on the ships or offload them. So if you click on that, you'll see this. Now, this was about 4 hours condensed into a minute and a half. Those carriers would move so slow that if you were there, you would not see them move. Obviously, people that work there, they know what's going on. They would be aware that the carriers are moving. But if you were there as a casual visitors, those carriers are moving so slow, you would not know that they were moving. But once you take 4 hours, you compress it into a minute, minute and a half, suddenly those carriers are moving along. And you get a sense of what's happening. And that's the beauty of time lapse, is because the timeline is compressed, you get a sense of how things develop and how things change. And that's the beauty of time lapse. Okay, so for that, the one on the straddle carrier, I think I had 4, maybe 5 cameras, different places, one down on the ground, one where they started, and then 2 or 3 along the route. And I would move cameras in position as well. And then obviously all my cameras had to have exactly the same timestamp. So I could generate videos from each. And then in post-production in my video editor program, where I create the time lapse, I could now chop and change and use bits from each one, and their timing would be perfect, in sync with each other. Any questions? I don't have access to the chat view when I'm
Okay,
sharing.
sorry. The question: how do you manage light changes?
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and pop back in. How do I stop sharing? I still see.
You've somehow managed to actually, I think, share 2 screens. There's an HPH750p screen. I'll stop sharing from here and
yeah,
see.
share. Yeah, kick that out. I think we're seeing your view as well. Okay, there we go.
Okay.
So sorry, repeat the question again. How to manage light changes?
How do you manage light changes?
Okay,
Yeah.
this is part of we'll do a little bit later. Light changes is tough. Okay, somebody's sharing screen, not me. Paul, that might be you.
No, it's I don't know what it is. It's HP.
Okay, so light changes is difficult. If you have continuous light that doesn't change, you shoot in manual exposure mode. But if you have light changes, you have to shoot in RAW. We're all grown-ups here, so you have to shoot in RAW, because the RAW allows you the most flexibility in changing your white balance and exposure. So you shoot in aperture priority when there's any kind of light change. And then there's a program called LR Time Lapse. We'll get to that in the end. Now, LR Time Lapse is about $100 US. If you do any kind of time lapses, it is absolutely an essential part of your workflow. That's the software. I just typed it out in the chat. And it's a German guy that created the software. And in my mind, he's an absolute genius. So you'll pull in, let's say, 600 images. You'll mark the first one as, here I've corrected the white balance and exposure in my RAW program. And you'll put up another marker. Here it changes to something else. The exposure changes or the white balance changes. You fix that RAW file. So you set that marker. And then, so you set 3, 4, 5 markers where things change, but you pull those 4 or 5 images in the RAW files you'll change the settings so that the files look the way you want to. And this LR time-lapse software will gradually change your white balance and your exposure to match from one to the other. So it's a gradual change. And LR time-lapse actually stand for level and ramp your time-lapse. And it'll just gradually change your white balance from one setting to the other, or your exposure as well. And then from the next point to the other point, gradually change it. So the software runs half an hour, 2 hours, iteratively changes your settings, your XMP files for your raw files. And if you then run it and it's not correct, you change your markers again, you change the white balance exposure again, you run it again and again until it's smooth. So that is how you manage light changes, is by that piece of software, running it iteratively on your several hundred, several thousand files. That software is absolutely essential. Otherwise, it looks like a mess, or you get jumps in exposure and jumps in white balance. It'll look amateurish, but that software is absolutely essential. So another question is, you mentioned using ND filters to smooth the transition each frame. Could you do it in post? Yes and no, but mostly no. The way to do it in post is there are programs that will take frames and blend the frames together, but then you get a weird jittery shimmering thing, which you sometimes have to do with long-term time-lapse, but generally it doesn't look good. The best is neutral density filter to pull your shutter speed down to 1 second or 2 seconds or whatever is appropriate for what you're doing. When you do long-term time-lapse, you can't do that because now it's out of control. You're shooting daytime and nighttime. So you just let it run, and your long-term time-lapse will tend to be a little bit, not jittery in exposure, but jittery in movement. It is just a side effect of that. But a time-lapse like that, camera pulling away on the dock in New York, I was in control there. I'd pull my shutter speed slow so that any movement is as smooth as I possibly can. Like a boat moving on the water is not discrete little jumps. It looks like it's smoothly moving along the water. Try for that. But you have to contend that the clouds are moving and the boats are moving, and they're moving at different rates. So you can't get to an intermediate setting where everything kind of looks okay. So,
Neil, your camera settings, is it completely locked in manual, or are you allowing the camera to have some control?
For a lot of the time lapses, I'm shooting aperture priority because the light changes. But something like that one time lapse that's inside the venue, I would shoot manual for short durations. But if I leave the camera for days, they're going to switch the light levels on and off for the party or testing. So I would shoot aperture priority, and then I would fix it in post with LR time lapse. But it's important that you shoot in RAW, just so you have that leeway in changes. So we'll go through this in the little program again. But if you have a camera on a tripod, you're shooting a landscape or something, or a city scene, and the light levels are going to change. You have to be in aperture priority, and you're going to diddle around with the software. Manual focus, absolutely always manual focus. You have to be in aperture priority, not program, not shutter priority, because your aperture needs to be absolutely fixed, because your depth of field needs to be fixed. If your depth of field is going to change, it's going to be a mess. You actually have to have a very specific depth of field. So aperture has to be fixed, whether you shoot manual or aperture priority, but most likely aperture priority. Vibration reduction off. You can't have the camera minutely resettling every time. You're just making your life more difficult. Auto ISO, yes-ish. I said auto ISO as well, but with a limit on the shutter speed. So when I do that, so auto ISO, yes. Auto white balance, yeah. The white balance in the end doesn't really matter because you are going to affect it with the software LR time lapse. You are going to change that. Okay, so let's go back into the program. I needed to wave my hands around a little bit for this one. Let's go back in the program. I'm going to find my spot. And let me just share the screen. Okay, so we're done with this page. We're going to go to the next page. So your basic time-lapse gear, a sturdy tripod. If you work with a lightweight tripod, if there's any kind of wind, it's going to shake. So as sturdy as you can. Intervalometer. Now, most of your cameras have a built-in intervalometer, which is perfect for time lapses that you shoot over an hour or 2 hours. Built-in intervalometer will do that. I think some of the Canons don't have a built-in intervalometer. You have to have an external intervalometer. For the long-term stuff where I have a camera set up inside a building that will run for a week, I have to have an external intervalometer because I run the camera off AC power. If the electrician switches off the power at the end of the night and switch it on the next day, if I was relying on my internal intervalometer, it would reset the camera and nothing would happen. I would lose everything from the second day. With an external intervalometer, this keeps running. So if you switch the power off in the building and the camera dies, the intervalometer keeps running, which is fine. Next morning, 7 o'clock, the workers come back in, they switch the power on, the camera wakes up and the intervalometer is still running, and then the camera takes photographs until they switch the power off. Intervalometer keeps running while the camera is dead. 7 o'clock on the Tuesday, camera wakes up, intervalometer triggers the camera. So external intervalometer is very necessary if you shoot time lapses that are in longer duration and relying on AC power and you're not there to control it. But for, I think most of what you guys are going to do, we're shooting tripod, city scene, or landscape with the clouds swirling around, use a built-in intervalometer. If it doesn't have a built-in intervalometer, external intervalometer, they're not that expensive. Obviously, a camera doesn't have to be a very intricate camera. You're going to be shooting probably at fairly low ISOs. So it doesn't have to be a camera that has fantastic high ISO capabilities. So pretty much, sorry, let me get back to my spot. Pretty much any camera can do. You're probably going to shoot with a wide angle lens because most of what I do, whether it's industrial work or commercial work or for myself, is a wide angle view. Now, keeping in mind, back to the idea of the camera, the high ISO settings is not that important. You're shooting 24 megapixels. You're going to squeeze that into a 1080p video file, 2 megapixels. You're just not going to see the noise at this point. So noise is not an issue generally. And then neutral density filters. We'll go over the necessity of that in the next few pages. Then there's advanced time-lapse gear. If you really want to kick this up a notch, you get motion control. You can go dolly, rotational. And then exposure control. This is where it becomes really interesting. Now, they call this the Holy Grail, where you control your time lapses from day to night and night to day. In other words, you blend from super bright daylight into nighttime, and it's a very smooth exposure. That's the Holy Grail. Now, you can do hardware for that. Now, the next page, there's a controller, and I've used several of them. This one is the more affordable, easiest to use one. It's called Timelapse Plus, the view. It controls the settings on the camera. It ramps the camera up and down for you, the settings. And then you're still going to use software. You're still going to use LR Timelapse software to generate a smooth video in the end. So just back to the previous page, you've got, for exposure control, you've got hardware and software options. So software options inevitably will be LR Timelapse. That's the software. I keep going on about it, but that is what you use for this, the Holy Grail. So that's the, if you want to show off with a time-lapse photographer, you do nighttime to day or day to night, and that's the Holy Grail, getting a smooth transition. Okay, any questions here? So that's the controller, but if you're starting out, it's not that necessary. You can shoot aperture priority and you juice it up with the software. Okay, shooting time-lapse sequences. This is when we now get to the how to do it part. Now, before we kick in, here are 2 links. If you want to read up on time-lapse photography and see amazing stuff, and I am in awe of these people, the link on the left-hand side goes to a website called Time-lapse network. So if you click through on that, there's tutorials there, videos there, tons of articles. Whenever I look at this, I realize I'm at the bottom end of the curve. I'm nowhere near learning everything there is about it. I am in awe of these guys and their capabilities and their techniques. So this is the place you want to be if you really want to learn more about it. Now, on the right-hand side, there's a link to a book on Amazon, Time Lapse Photography. It's by a guy called Ryan Chilinsky. This, for me, is the definitive book on the introduction of time lapse photography. And a few of the slides later on are screen captures from his book. So highly recommend it if you want to read more about it, is this book by Ryan Chilinsky. He lays it out in a very easy to understand way. Okay, so with that done, let's get into the nitty-gritty of it. The basic time-lapse shooting workflow. First off, composition. We're getting back to the basics of photography. You have to have an interesting scene. So that's the basic thing of photography. Whatever you're presenting to somebody who's looking at the photograph, it's got to be interesting in some way or another. So the same thing with time-lapse. It's got to be an interesting scene that you're photographing. So your composition has to be dynamic. It has to be a low view or things in the foreground, the background. It's just got to be interesting. So all the rules, all that things that you know about photography still apply. But where it becomes a little more tricky is you have to anticipate how the scene will change. And how the scene will change will depend on the clouds. It'll depend on cars moving across. It'll depend on people moving. It'll be how night changes to day and day to night, whatever it is, but you'll have to anticipate how the scene will change. So this is now the complication here. Okay, so next part, the program interval. We have to figure out the speed and the flow of the action. How long will the sequence be and the duration of the event being photographed. So clouds moving, you're going to use a certain interval. People moving, cars moving, these are all different intervals. Long-term time lapse, where they're demolishing buildings, it's going to take a shot every 5 minutes. Clouds moving, you're going to take a shot every 2 seconds. So your interval where you take the photograph will be dependent on the subject. And you'll have to figure out, there are certain guidelines for that, which we'll go over. Now, how long should the sequence be? In other words, how long will your final video be? And the ideal always is around about a minute. You're going to lose an audience if it's much longer than that. So if you're shooting a time lapse to show on Facebook or your website or Instagram, a minute. Aim for that. The commercial stuff that I shoot for my clients, like that long-term time lapse, I gave them an 8-minute video. Project manager's going to love that. I gave them a 4-minute video. I gave them a 2-minute video. So they'll probably use a 2-minute video to show to visitors. But in the discussion with the other people involved with the project, they probably want to see that 8-minute one and really get to send more detailed overview of what's happening. And then also important, the duration of the event being photographed. Now, landscape changing is however long it needs to be. But let's say you're photographing construction of something. Somebody putting up a tool shed, a garden shed in your garden, or building a swimming pool, whatever it might be. There's a specific duration. It's going to be an hour, 2 hours, a day, a few days. You kind of have to figure it out. And that duration of the event, let's say 3 hours, you're going to have to chop it up into little intervals. So your program interval, you have to figure out the speed of your action, how long the sequence should be, your final sequence, and the duration of events being photographed. This will affect your camera settings. So let's pop on to the next slide. We're on slide 15. And this is from Ryan Chilinsky's book. So no two scenes are exactly alike, but there are some common interval durations that will give you a good start. So for 1 second, so in other words, you're chopping your timeline up in 1 second intervals, fast moving clouds, moving traffic, 2 to 3 seconds, sunsets, sunrises, slow moving clouds, crowds, the moon and the sun near the horizon, and things photographed with a telephoto lens. And then much longer, 15 to 30 seconds or so, moving shadows, sun across the sky, stars, fast growing plants, and construction projects, Construction 5 to 15 minutes, makes sense. Now, the top thing there, moving shadows, this is very interesting. If you're photographing time lapse in the city on a cloudy day, it's probably not that interesting because it's all even lighting. What makes it interesting very often is the shadows changing. So the sun moving across will means the shadows are sweeping across and changing. So daylight where the sun is shining is usually a lot more interesting than very overcast. Okay, next slide, 16. Selecting a time-lapse interval. So the interval is the amount of time between the shots. With that single number, that one number, the interval, you control two things. How fast the time-lapse change will appear to take place, and how smooth the action appears on the screen. So if you have cars moving, if you take a photograph now and the car's moved a distance, and then again, you're going to get kind of a jumpy sequence. But if the cars move, you're going to chop it up so the car still seems to move smoothly. Unless you're looking at general city traffic, that changes again with the lights at night. So how smooth you want that action to appear on the screen, that'll depend on your interval and how fast that change appears. And then also important, as we mentioned, the length of your video. If you're going to compile several videos together, I would suggest a minimum of 10 to 12 seconds. You're going to, if you, let's say you shoot 5 sequences and you put them together to make a minute or so video. If you have short little sequences of a few seconds, it's going to be too jumpy. Your mind doesn't have time to focus on what's happening there. So I would aim for a minimum of 10 to 12 seconds if you're going to compile different sections. If you're doing just one scene, I would say a minute. Now, YouTube metrics have shown that after 60 seconds, the viewership drops. So people, unless it's truly fascinating, after a minute, people are dropping off because you're competing with a billion other videos out there. And so your video has to be very interesting, or otherwise just keep it to a minute, keep people's interest. Okay, so the next step, you have to decide on the frame rate. So your video, you can go 30 frames a second, 24 frames a second, 25 frames a second. In New Zealand, what do you guys use, NTC or PAL? PAL. I think you're muted.
We use PAL.
PAL. So PAL is, I think, 25 frames a second. So that should very likely be a default frames per second choice for you. Video on YouTube, 30 frames a second work. And here in America, people still cling to the idea that 24 frames a second is cinematic. Anyway, you can pick your frame rate in post-production, but I think for you guys, 25 frames a second will probably be your default. Now, the examples I have later on works on 30 frames a second, but the math translates easy enough. So the frame rate affects our calculations, but you do that on the export of the video. So it's a later on consideration. Okay, slide 17. Okay, bit of math, but I hope I don't lose you here. This is like the simplest math ever. So you're doing a landscape and you have fast moving clouds. Let's say you want a 10-second clip because you want to do a 2-minute view eventually of different landscape scenes and the one area. So let's say you want a 10-second clip, but you don't just want 10 seconds, you want a bit of a buffer, because if you're going to crossfade from one sequence to the other sequence, you want a bit of a buffer. At the minimum, I would say 12 seconds. So now in the example here, I work on a frame rate of 30 frames a second. That's very often what YouTube videos are, 30 frames a second. So you want 12 seconds at a rate of 30 frames per second. How many photographs are you going to take? There's 30 photos per second, 12 seconds. The math is very simple, 30 times 12. You want to take 360 photographs. That's how many photographs you need to take to have exactly 12 seconds at a frame rate of 30 frames a second. So when you set up your tripod and you have a scene, you're going to take 360 photographs to generate 12 seconds of video. Now, those 360 photographs, you could take it in a few minutes or an hour or 2 hours. This is now where you have to decide your sort of artistic intent and also what is possible with a scene that you have in front of you. Okay, so the next slide, 19. So we've got 360 photographs. So now we have to decide on our interval. So for fast-moving clouds, as we saw earlier on there, 2 seconds is generally a good choice. So now we have to calculate our shooting time. We have 360 photographs at every 2 seconds. How long will our shooting time be? 360 times 2. 720 seconds, which is 12 minutes. So you're going to stand out there for 12 minutes with your tripod to generate 360 photographs at 2-second intervals. Very simple math. And if this kind of throws you off, just go over it again and again. It's very simple. It all interlocks. There are time-lapse calculators, apps that you can download that'll do the math for you. But these decisions all locked in place with each other. So you're going to stand there for 12 minutes, taking 360 photographs every 2 seconds to generate a 12-second video at 30 frames a second. These are all interlocked. Okay, so camera settings, exposure settings. I would generally suggest aperture priority, and then smoothing it out, the exposure and white balance in software called LR Timelapse. Now you also have to minimize flicker. Now this is where it gets a little interesting. Flicker you can minimize with LR Timelapse, but where flicker also comes up is, I'm going to stop the screen share here. Now, where flicker comes in as well is, we all have the idea if you shoot at f8, that f8 is a very specific aperture. It is, but we're also dealing with real world limitations. If you have, all our cameras these days are open aperture metering. So you're shooting with your camera at open aperture, but the moment it takes the photo off, it closes down to f8 and then up again. So if you take a shot, boom, f8 and open again. So you have a brighter view. 40 years ago, you'd have to manually open up, focus, and then stop down and then shoot. That was a pain. So we have open aperture metering. But this also means that if you take the shot, it closes down to f8-ish. Could be a fraction less, could be a fraction more. Now, if you shoot landscapes, to photograph here and there, you photograph family, you photograph things, or in the studio, photograph groups of people, portraits, f8 and a tiny bit more or a tiny bit less looks like f8. You're not going to see that variation in exposure. You're just not going to see it. But the moment you have 900 frames, and it's f8 and tiny bit less, tiny bit more, tiny bit less, f8, and it's that minute change, because it doesn't always stop down to exactly the same thing, because it's a mechanical thing. We're dealing with real world limitations. So f8 is not always f8. So what happens then is, if you look at 900 photographs, the exposure varies and you have flicker. You can get rid of it with software. But what a lot of photographers do, for example, you have a lot of time-lapse photographers shoot with Canon cameras and then mount Nikon lenses on it, old manual focus Nikon lenses, because they will focus and get all settings ready and then they'll close down. With no connection between the lens and the camera, that lens stays at exactly f8 and never changes for the next decade. It just stays the same because it's not open aperture and closing all that. So one of the ways to reduce flicker is to shoot with some kind of mechanical, some manual lens where there's no mechanical or electronic connection between the lens and the camera. That's one way of doing it. Alternately, LR time-lapse. Okay, questions. Did I say YouTube requires 30 frames a second? I don't know. I use 30 frames a second because most of my stuff goes on YouTube or Vimeo. It looks good. I think if you shoot for that, then go 30 frames a second. But I think maybe just do a little bit of research how it works for you guys with a 25 frames a second with PAL and 3 frames a second. I'm unsure about that. Let me go back to some other questions. Auto ISO, auto white balance, we did that. Recommendations for external intervalometer. For Nikon, I have the Nikon intervalometer. Each brand of camera have their proprietary intervalometer. Then B&H has the Velo intervalometer. They're not expensive at all. If depending on what camera you use, I would use that brand. I kind of stay with the marquee brand, and or alternately, Velo is a good choice as well. Nikon has settings for interval timelapse shooting and timelapse movie settings. Okay, so Barry asked about cameras like the Nikon that has a built-in time-lapse movie. I thought that was a good idea, and that's how I shot in the beginning. However, you take away all control in how you generate the movie. It's like shooting JPEG, and that's what they're pretty much doing. That video they're shooting there, your settings are baked in. Your contrast, your exposure, your white balance, everything is baked in. You've got no control, which is nice if you just want to generate a quick video, but I think you can use your iPhone for that. To do it properly, you have to shoot in RAW, because then in your post-production, you have your 300 RAW files. You can adjust your exposure, you can bring up your contrast, lower your contrast, bring up the shadow detail. This is without getting into LR time-lapse even. Just looking at your 300 photographs that are exposed correctly, you can now bring up your shadow detail. You can control your highlights. You can play with your colors, more saturation, whatever it is. You can really control your files, and then you generate your video. So as I said, I started with a built-in time-lapse thing in Nikon. I would strongly suggest shooting RAW and properly generating video. Do I recommend using exposure smoothing while capturing images? Yeah, but you are going to smooth the exposure anyway with the software. Are there buffer issues? Not really. With most time lapses, you take a shot every 5 seconds. Your camera has plenty of time to write the file in, except if you have 3-second exposures. Then taking a shot every 5 seconds, you might run into buffer issues, but generally you don't hit buffer issues because your images are timed. Can a USB power bank be used to keep power to camera for several hours? Yes, absolutely. Okay, and let's go back into the program. Let me find my place again. Okay, so camera exposure settings, I would say aperture priority, you can use auto ISO, minimize flicker, do it in post-production, or if you can, have some, if your camera allows, if you have older lenses, you can set up so that there's no communication and aperture never changes. Creating motion blur, shutter speed, neutral density filters. So generally you want as slow a shutter speed as possible to have that continuous movement. You want to have that perception of the flow of movement. And for that, you can use neutral density filters to pull the shutter speed lower. Okay, now here's also an important part. So we're going to go to slide 22. Again, this is from Ryan Chalinsky's book, which I highly recommend. So you have your interval, which can be 2 seconds, 5 seconds, 1/8 of a second, whatever it is, depending on the scene and all of that. Your exposure time must not exceed your interval length. So obviously you can't have a 4-second interval and your exposure is 4 seconds. That's just not going to work. You're going to hit trouble. So you have to have a bit of time for your camera to write the file from the buffer to the card, etc. Now, if you look at the bottom one, if your shutter is closed for the most of your interval, so in other words, you have a little bit of exposure and then nothing, shutter's closed, and then exposure, etc., you're going to have minimal motion blur. Your image is going to be sharp, but it's going to be very choppy movement, which is not ideal. Normal motion blur is where your exposure time is half of your interval. So if you figure out your scene, you want 4-second intervals, you want to aim for your shutter speed to be 2 seconds at least, maybe 3. I would err towards the generous side to really smooth it out. and that'll give you normal motion blur, and you'd get that sense of continuous movement instead of being choppy movement. Maximum blur, your shutters open for the most of the duration of the interval, but you can hit buffer problems then. So I would say, where it says normal motion blur, I would say half, maybe 2/3 of your interval should be exposure time. Now, as photographers, we kind of locked into the idea we want sharp images. We want, if somebody is running or jumping or something, you want kind of sharp movement to show the action. Video is different. You want that continuity of movement. So that motion blur gives you a sense of movement instead of chop, 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 chop as the subject is jittery in your frame. You want that motion blur. So your individual frame will show blur, but in the final video, it'll be continuous and smooth and much more pleasing than a choppy view. Okay, so interval choice and shutter speed. Let me just quickly see here. Let me find my place again. Okay, so we've got interval choice and shutter speed. That's slide 23. On the right-hand side, there's a page that describes this again on my website. Now, on the left-hand side, you've got a city scene. Now, the first half of this clip was shot with a 30-second shutter speed and a 45-second intervals. Now, the 45-second interval means the cloud has moved considerably from frame to frame, but there's a 30-second shutter speed, so the motion blur is really smooth. But remember, the suggestion was every 2 seconds, but here I went for 45 seconds. So in other words, the clouds have moved a considerable distance between shots. So what you get is this rush of clouds. It looks frantic. It looks a little crazy. You can use that for dramatic effect maybe, but in this instance, a more relaxed tempo is needed. So the second half of the clip, I went for a 4-second shutter speed and a 5-second interval. So we dropped from 45 seconds to 5 seconds, and the tempo is immediately more pleasing to the eye. So click through on that video and have a look. It'll open up a Vimeo video clip, and you'll see it's a fairly short video. You can play it a few times. You can see the first half, it's just frantic clouds, which is a 45-second, and then the next one, 5-second interval. And I think even that is a little fast, slow. We could have gone there. I think 2 seconds would have been better. So you just play that again and get the sense of 45 seconds interval. So because the shutter speed is very slow, it's smooth, but the sense of movement is just frantic, which is not good. And even 5 seconds, I think, would be a little too fast. So that is how your interval, your choice of interval affects how your movement appears. And if you go onto that page, you can click on it later on. It'll open up an article on the website that talks about camera settings for time-lapse photography, and it'll explain all this stuff again in detail, because there's a lot of information thrown at you here. So go through over this PDF file again, and definitely click through on the links and read up about it. And there's a very specific set thought process behind this. It's as I said earlier on, it's all interlinked. Okay, so the next page again, shutter speed choice. There's a time-lapse clip of the naked cowboy in Times Square. The interval was 3 seconds. In the first sequence, my shutter speed was a 60th, which is very short. So instead of 3-second interval and maybe a second or 2-second shutter speed, I choose very short. You'll see it's very choppy. I brought my shutter speed later on down to 1/2 second. You don't really need the individual image to be crisply sharp. Think in terms of video. It's the fluid movement that creates the sensation of movement. So click through on that one with a naked cowboy, and you'll see the same thing again. So the more that's blurred, you lose the individual detail of people, but you get a more smooth movement of the passers-by. Yeah, so he's down at number 3. If your shutter speed is too high, you will get a jittery staccato effect. So just a 20-second video. And as soon as my shutter speed is much slower, you lose the detail, but I think the sense of the movement is more pleasing and less jittery and nervous. Okay, so let's get back into the program. Let's go to slide 25. Time-lapse exposure settings. Shoot in manual exposure mode in your camera where you can, but if you're going to shoot a wildly changing scene, aperture priority. Going to obviously juggle your ISO, aperture, shutter speed for correct exposure, while still considering your interval. The interval becomes really important. Your interval, as we mentioned before, that sets how fluid your movement is going to be.
Neil, do you want to move on what
Oh,
you're
I am on the wrong page. Let me find it. Sorry, man.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, shooting manual exposure mode, and as with photography, you juggle your ISO, aperture, and shutter speed for correct exposure, while still considering your interval. Interval in time lapse is all important. That's the thing we hinge all our decisions on, is the interval. Now we do want to create some motion blur, and especially if you're shooting bright daylight. If you're shooting f11, that's going to be 30th of a second, 60th of a second. Might be too fast. So you want a 6 times neutral density filter, or even a 10 times neutral density filter to really bring your shutter speed way down. What's your exposure length? It can't be longer than the interval. So if you shoot aperture priority, make sure that if you shoot auto ISO and then set a limit to how long your shutter speed can be, so that at some point you ramp your ISO up rather than go too long on your shutter speed, because you don't want your shutter speed close to your length of the interval. So you got to balance those things. And again, shoot in raw mode for control of your white balance, exposure, contrast, saturation, all of those things. Now, all important, manual focus. You absolutely do not want autofocus. If you have autofocus, that camera's going to hunt and it's going to grab focus differently every time. It looks ridiculous. It looks disgusting. You're going to you'll throw the footage away. You're going to waste all the time you shot. So absolutely not autofocus. It has to be manual focus. Switch your VR or your stabilization off. Make sure your batteries are full. Make sure your memory cards are empty. Now, I shoot with cameras that have dual card slots. I tend to work with them as overflow rather than backup. So instead of raw plus raw as backup, I'm taking the risk and I'm shooting it as overflow, because I can't always get and swap camera cards out. So I tend to shoot it so that the cards overflow into the next one, because I often shoot for hours on end. Minimizing flicker, if possible, shoot in manual exposure mode and use manual lenses. As I explained, try and get, if you can, manual lens that stops down and doesn't do the open aperture metering. And then you can correct this with deflickering software. There are options available, but I'm going to mention this again, LR Time Lapse. That is actually the software we want. And then test and organize. So because you're going to stand there for an hour, maybe 2 hours shooting a time lapse, you don't want to miss a crucial setting. You want to make sure all 3 legs of the tripod are solid. You want to make sure your camera is locked. You make sure that everything is steady. Just go over your checklist and make sure everything is locked in, because you do not want to waste 2 hours of beautiful light and beautiful whatever is happening there. So test and organize, crucial step. Now, finally, post-production. This is the software, LR Time Lapse, and this is the way it looks. It's going to auto-generate all kinds of interesting graphs for you as it changes the white balance and the exposure for you to get as smooth a curve as it possibly can. And again, the guy that wrote the software is an absolute genius. I don't know how he did this, but you cannot do this manually. You cannot manually adjust 300 files. Trust me, you want to spend $100 on a software. And this is the way it looks. This is the way your screen looks. And again, the graphs on the right-hand side, it's got all the files, and it'll tell you exactly what it's doing. And the top right-hand pane has the steps you're going to click through. So you click through each step by step. If you do it again, you might skip a few steps, but that's the process you go through. Firstly, you go and have, let's say you have your 300 files, you go your first and end file, you adjust your white balance and exposure you need to be. Those are your keyframes. You set it as keyframes. You set it as a keyframe here by going Command 4, making it 4 stars. 4 stars means it's a keyframe. It'll take those settings and adjust everything else in between to those keyframes. It's simple to use. The software, the guy that wrote the software has a bunch of tutorials on this. So again, this is it. Now to generate the time-lapse clip, you can use iMovie, I use Final Cut Pro, you can use Premiere, but you are going to have to use video software. So what you do is you sweeten your raw files here the way you want it to be, generate your JPEGs, pull it into Final Cut Pro or iMovie, and you get your settings to generate generate video out of those, and boom, you have a time-lapse video. Now, when you use Final Cut Pro or other programs, you pull in 300 images, you set the duration for the file to show as 1 frame. And there you go. Finally, I shoot with a 36 megapixel camera, and that's overkill. But what happens is I need this because here, for example, I was shooting in Manhattan, and the ultra wide angle lens that was zoomed to 16 millimeters, shooting all up, you get the buildings leaning in. You want to correct the converging vertical, so you pull that out. So your 36 megapixels suddenly becomes 24 megapixels. So you'd have to have that real estate to play around here, and you might want to crop in a bit. Now for this video, I will post the link in chat in a minute. For this video, I defined the entire frame, a keyframe, as my start. Then I defined a keyframe later on down here as sort of a midpoint. And they wanted to highlight one of the buildings in the center. So then I set a keyframe for a smaller section of the video. So the video here looks like it's infinitely zooming in. But at no point was the video setting such that I used less resolution than it needed. In other words, when I cropped in, I made sure that I still had enough image space there that I could still generate 1080p video. Okay, so that kind of brings us to the end of this thing. So let me just quickly find that video I wanted to post there.
Neil, can you also post the link to your naked cowboy, that particular page, both left and right items on it link to the page from your blog?
Okay, give me 1 second here. I'll get to that. Okay, so first of all, here is, the naked cowboy is a little bit lower down. So I'll get through that link now. Here is the time lapse I was talking about, where I set a keyframe wide, middle, and then higher up tight. And even here, the tight one here, I used enough area on my photographs that are still more information that 1080p video needed. So people are always amazed that I could zoom in infinitely on this thing and I never lose resolution. But I always had more resolution on the photographs than 1080p requires. So it remains sharp all the way through. So that's kind of difficulty that some people have, difficulty wrapping their minds around that. Tilt and shift lenses, absolutely. You can use a tilt and shift lens. That'll make your life a lot easier in post, because the moment you pull the converging verticals in post, you lose a bit of detail. For tilt and shift lens will give you a sharper image. That is the way it works. Whether you can notice it or not is another thing, but I would recommend tilt and shift lens if you want to really go there. If you don't have that, fix it in post. Bridge or Lightroom, you can just correct your stuff. Naked cowboy, I'll do that now. How do I weatherproof my gear? If I stand there, plastic bag and gaffer tape. I always have a filter on my lens because I often shoot in dusty environments. But tape and gaffer tape and plastic if I need it to be. So naked cowboy thingy, let me find that again for you. I'll post the link here. If you click through on that PDF file, you'll see it as well, but I'll repost the link here.
They have found it, Neil. It's on that page.
It's number 3 on the page. You've got to click now.
Yeah.
But it's also useful reading the rest of it because it's a longer discussion about exactly the same thing. And then another important page, let me get to it. Also linked on the same page where we had that crazy clouds, where we discuss camera settings and discusses everything here we talked about today. And as I said, there's a lot of information thrown out at you, but go through the stuff again. The results can look fantastic. And if you step through a checklist of basic things to do, you'll get good results. You're going to need a tripod. You're going to need neutral density filter. Those are the 2 things that you're going to have to need, you're going to require for time-lapse photography. But if you go through those pages there, it'll tell you it'll go through step by step again how to get to your choice of settings. Time-lapse of stars, dude, Barry, go to their website, Time-lapse Network. It's a specialized thing that I just haven't done that yet, but yeah, you're gonna have to find a place where there's no light leakage or light pollution, which I think is easier in New Zealand than here around New York. Go through on the Time-lapse Network page. There'll be pages there. They'll give that information. It's not something that I've delved in that I can really give advice to you authoritatively. Okay. Any other questions, guys? How long have we been at this? An hour and a half.
Yeah.
It's a good portion of time. Hopefully it was interesting. Hopefully there was some information here. Hopefully something clicked for you. It might need a little bit more research, get your stuff together, but I do think that a lot of the stuff is accessible to everyone, and it'll open up a new adventure in photography for you.
Thanks, Neil. That was fantastic.
I see my camera has a screen cover. The Nikon D810 has a clip-on plastic cover that it comes with that I use because the cameras get knocked around here and there. I try not to have too much damage. And then all my cameras anyway have the shield stuck to it because I don't like the LCD to get scratched.
Okay.
So any questions? I think I've brought it as far as I can.
Yep.
Jodelle has discovered an interval timer. Yay. Yeah, neutral density filters. That's going to change things for you. It's going to make your videos look a lot smoother.
It's interesting your comment about allowing blur in the photos, because my mind do often come jerky, and I realize that's because I'm shooting too short a time.
Exactly. So somebody asked here about the dome that I use for long-term time lapse. I'm going to type it up here in the chat. It's by a company called Harbortronics. If you go to harbortronics.com, you'll get there. I'm not sure if they're still in business. They merged with an Australian company called Photo Sentinel. So they merged with Photo Sentinel, and I'm not quite sure what their setup is at the moment. So between Photo Sentinel and Harbotronics, you'll get there. But if you search on YouTube for it, there's a ton of advice on how to create waterproof housings for yourself if you're into the DIY thing. Yeah, there you go, harbotronics.com. But I'm not sure if they're in business as a standalone company anymore, or whether it's with Photo Sentinel or whatever their deal is. Tips for sensor cleaning. Oh boy, yes. If you use that liquid sensor cleaning liquid in a swab, you're just swirling shit around on your sensor. You're not lifting anything up. You're just swirling around it. You don't get it clean. I'm going to give you a link here that's on my website. I use a gel stick. This changed everything for me because I did time lapse for a woman that wanted 13 minutes of clouds swirling around the sky for some art project. So I spent a month shooting this. So the first day I shot with different cameras, set it up on a roof of a building, and shooting at f11 or f16, you see every single spot of dust. And you're shooting at a small aperture because you're trying to pull your shutter speed down, even with a neutral density filter. I found I deleted a day's worth of shooting, and I drove myself a little nuts trying to clean my sensors to a truly spotless point. So what I do is I now have a gel stick by iLead. Give me a second. Let me go find it and I'll show it for you. Anyway, I posted the link there. You click through and it's iLead. Hang on a minute. So you have to have a loop like this that you can eye your sensor and see in magnified detail what a sensor looks like. But this is the magic. This changed things for me. It's called a little gel stick. Now it's focusing my eyes. Let me see if I can grab focus. There you go. It's a little gel stick. So what you do is with the loop, switch it on so it shines a little blue light on your sensor, and then you can go in, you can tap, 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 clean your sensor. This changed everything for me. If you shoot with mirrorless or anything where there's vibration, sensor cleaning, set your camera to clean the sensor and then don't switch off. That locks the sensor. And then you can take a swab and pick dust off. And you have a little piece of paper that you can clean the sensor swab with. But this absolutely changed everything for me in keeping my sensor spotless. But it also helps that I don't change lenses. Because every time you change the lens, dust gets in. Okay, any other questions? Photo Sentinel?
I think basically that's it.
That's it.
Neil, it's been a fantastic session. Thank you so much for this. Mindful of the fact that it's now 25 to 11 there and you have a wedding to photograph tomorrow.
I'm a night owl. I don't get much sleep, so this is good.
Right.
Are there any dangers shooting into the sun? I don't know. I don't think so. Not at proper settings, but I might be wrong. But not that I'm aware of. Thank you, everyone. I'm glad to hear that this was a very useful, interesting session for everyone. That there's useful information here that will affect the photography that you approach from here on.
Cool. Well, yeah. So thanks everybody for joining in. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. We will edit the video and we'll make it available on the YouTube channel, and we'll share the link with everybody and also share the chat transcript with those links that Neil has put in there. But yeah, enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
you. See ya.
Thanks a lot, guys.
That was awesome, Paul.
Cool. Just going to pause the video recording.